Plain Talk Podcast. I'm your host, Rob Port. Later in the show, we're going to have an interview with Jodi Smith. Now, she is the director of the North Dakota Department of Trust Lands, which you may not think that sounds very interesting, but essentially her department is in charge of all the lands and all the minerals that are owned by the state of North Dakota. Believe it or not, North Dakota actually the state owns a lot of land. Some of it coming back, dating back to the Depression era when a lot of farmers would just give up and leave their property behind. The state ended up with a lot of that property. They lease it out for grazing or they lease it out for agricultural purposes. The state also owns some mineral resources, and those mineral resources get developed at times, be they like gravel pits or oil or natural gas. They get developed, and the state makes royalties. The state makes revenue off this land, and that revenue goes to the various funds, and basically there's a lot there to manage. Now, what's going on, and the reason why I have Jodi Smith on is there's some controversy over what Jodi Smith is describing as underpayments to certain state funds, like the Common Schools Trust funds, related to a new tax agreement on oil tax revenues on the reservations. Now, this is all really complicated, but suffice it to say that the state has a number of funds that you'll often hear referred to by lawmakers and other policymakers as buckets. And as the state makes revenue from the oil taxes, this money flows into the different buckets, and the person in charge of making all those deposits is the state treasurer. And Jodi Smith says the state treasurer hasn't been following law, or at least their interpretation of the law. Now, the treasurer, to be clear, Kelly Schmidt, what she says is that her department has followed the law. They got advisement from the Attorney General's office. They tried to get a fix from the legislature. The legislature shot it down. But it could be a mess. And as our state has been struggling with tight budgets, and this legislative session, there may need to be an appropriation. There may need to be some money moved around. It's not necessarily an easy fix, suffice it to say. And as we all watch the legislature and we all have, different things we'd like to see happen, different priorities or whatever, this could be a wild card. This could be a factor. Anyway, we're going to talk with Jodi Smith about that a little bit later in the show. But first, I wanted to get to something that former Senator Heidi Heitkamp said during an interview on MSNBC this week. Now, former Senator Heitkamp was doing an interview with Casey Hunt. Casey Hunt is an MSNBC host, and it was kind of about the Green New Deal and a few other things. It was a short interview, but what's interesting is the way Senator Heitkamp talked about her 2018 election loss. Now, when you've been watching politics for as long as I have, one thing that politicians who lose an election love to do is, especially if it's a high-profile election, what they love to do is find excuses for why they lost that don't really have anything to do with them. The answer and the question and answer is interesting, and I actually have the audio, which I'm going to play for you right now.
It's interesting. I hear kind of the lessons learned a little bit in how you talk about this from your own races, and I'm interested what you took away from your loss in 2018 in this past election. You were somewhat of an unlikely Democrat in the first place. Some people were surprised to see a Democrat winning in North Dakota, but obviously something changed from the time when you were able to pull that off and this more recent election. What lessons did you take away of your loss, and what has changed?
It's interesting, Casey, because if you look, and you've spent a lot of time in the hallways, if you looked at two of the single most important initiatives that passed in the last 6 years for the fossil fuel industry was the exportation of crude oil, which I led in the Senate and basically got across the finish line in a year, and the passage of a tax credit for carbon capture, sequestration, and utilization so that we could advance new technologies to attack climate, but also take a look at how the fossil industry could be part of the solution. Neither one of those really made a whole lot of difference because I was branded as a Democrat. I was branded as somebody who didn't care about those jobs. And, it goes back to Secretary Clinton basically saying, we're going to put a lot of coal miners out of work. That's frightening to anyone. And I think we have to start understanding that if we're going to represent working people, there's a lot of working people who work on oil rigs, a lot of working people who work in coal mines and in the fossil fuel industry. They need to hear where their role is going to be moving forward in this economy. And I think that's a mistake the Democratic Party makes, is they want to address climate, which is important. but you absolutely have to address jobs.
Yeah.
She got a little raspy there at the end, but first of all, two reactions to that. First, I feel like Casey Hunt needs to prepare for her interviews a little bit, because she starts off talking about how surprised everybody was that a Democrat like Heidi Heitkamp won in North Dakota, which, if Casey Hunt had actually followed politics in North Dakota at all, and indeed followed the history of that Senate seat that Senator Heitkamp used to occupy, she would know that that seat has been in control of the Democratic Party since August of 1960. That's right, Quentin Burdick first took that seat in August of 1960 when Dwight D. Eisenhower was president. So Democrats have held a seat since Eisenhower was president, since the Eisenhower administration. And this shallow puddle on national television is talking about how everybody was surprised that a Democrat won that seat. Also, prior to 2010, every single seat in North Dakota's federal delegation was held by a Democrat and had been held by Democrats since, for a couple of decades. Kent Conrad, Byron Dorgan, Earl Pomeroy, they held those seats for a long, long time. So I don't know that it's any big surprise. Certainly North Dakota has moved to the right of late. Certainly North Dakota is seen as a red state now. And certainly, historically, we always vote for president. In fact, I don't, for Republican presidents, I don't know that we voted for a Democratic president since Lyndon Johnson's landslide victory after his first election after the Kennedy administration, the Kennedy assassination. So that's, North Dakota is an odd political place. But if you're going to say that you're surprised that somebody like Heidi Heitkamp won in 2012, well, I guess maybe you could say that we're all surprised that she pulled it out. We're all surprised that she barely won and held on to a seat that Democrats had held for decades, I guess. But it's just kind of an ignorant thing to say, and clearly Ms. Hunt didn't spend a lot of time preparing for that interview. But from what Senator Heitkamp says, I want to read to you the quote of what she actually said. She said, "I was branded as a Democrat. I was branded as somebody who didn't care about those jobs. And, it goes back to Secretary Clinton basically saying we're going to put coal miners out of work. That's frightening to anyone." Well, there's a couple things about Heidi Heitkamp saying that. First and foremost, she was branded as a Democrat because she is, in fact, a Democrat. I didn't choose that partisan affiliation for former Senator Heitkamp. She chose it for herself. She chose to identify with the Democratic Party. Now, if it became a liability, well, whose fault is that? Right? To say that she was branded as a Democrat, that makes it sound like some external source came in and said, that's a Democrat. And it wasn't, in fact, Senator Heitkamp, paying her party dues and being a super delegate to national conventions and being a delegate to national conventions before she was even elected as U.S. Senator. Going back to the 1990s, she was elected to state-level office as a Democrat, and then before that, she was a Democratic tax commissioner. Senator Heitkamp has literally been a member of the North Dakota Democratic Party and indeed the National Democratic Party for decades. Nobody branded her that way. She branded herself that way. She says, I was branded that way. You branded yourself that way, Senator Heitkamp. You accepted the nomination of the North Dakota Democratic Party to be their candidate for the United States Senate. You were the incumbent. You did the same thing in 2012. Now, again, I get that being a Democrat in North Dakota is a bit of a liability this year, of late. But come on. I mean, have some accountability for the choices that you make. And, oh, by the way, invoking Senator Clinton, saying, well, they hung Senator Clinton's words around me. Or, I shouldn't put words in the former senator's mouth. She said, and, it goes back to Senator Clinton basically saying we're going to put a lot of coal miners out of work. That's frightening to anyone. Well, guess who endorsed Hillary Clinton to run for president in 2016? Again, that was Heidi Heitkamp. As a matter of fact, in 2013, in Senator Heitkamp's first year in the United States Senate, and years before the 2016 election, Heidi Heitkamp signed on to a letter encouraging then Secretary of State Hillary Clinton to run for the presidency. Now, who did that? Nobody branded Senator Heitkamp with her support for Hillary Clinton. As a matter of fact, former Senator Heitkamp was so vigorous in her endorsement of Hillary Clinton. You might remember from the election cycle last year, the Kevin Cramer campaign. Kevin, of course, ultimately won that United States Senate seat. But you might remember they actually ran an ad which had Heidi Heitkamp literally shouting her support for Hillary Clinton, talking about how she's going to be the best president ever. Now, again, Heidi Heitkamp did that to herself. Now, there's always a lot of people who say, well, it's important to vote for the person over the party, right? Partisan affiliation shouldn't matter that much, yada, yada, yada. But here's the thing. It is important to consider. Because if your senator belongs to a political party that essentially, through regulation and other sort of policy making, wants to shut down or severely inhibit some of the most important industries to your state economy, and I'm not just talking about mining, and I'm not just talking about oil development. Let's not forget what the Obama administration was doing to the farmers with regulations like the Waters for the U.S. rule. Right? So if you belong to that political party, then it's fair to say, listen, Senator Heitkamp may be friendly to farming. She may be friendly, relatively, for a Democrat to the oil industry. She may be friendly, relatively, for a Democrat to coal mining. But she also belongs to a political party and is going to be one vote towards putting somebody like Chuck Schumer to be the majority leader in the United States Senate. That's the problem. It's why Senator Heitkamp's partisan affiliation matters. It's probably why she's grousing that everybody, quote unquote, branded her as a Democrat. Well, you know what, Senator? You branded yourself. And again, partisan affiliation matters. I realize, again, it can be tiresome, the partisan games we play. I mean, right now, I'll tell you, I'm a little frustrated with the Republicans who have been backing President Donald Trump's play on declaring this emergency declaration, declaring an emergency at the southern border in order to get around, Congress being obstinate on finding a deal to address illegal immigration. Now, I'm as frustrated as anybody else about illegal immigration, but I don't want, just because we have a Republican president, I don't want all of a sudden to give that president a whole bunch of new powers to declare national emergencies, not because we have an emergency, but because we have a policy that president wants to put in place. I don't like that kind of partisanship. I don't like blind loyalty to, a president simply because that president happens to have the right partisan affiliation, but also you can't ignore it. You can't ignore that voting for Senator Heitkamp in 2018 was a vote towards giving a political party, which doesn't want a lot of very good things for a place like North Dakota, to put them in charge of the United States Senate. There was no ignoring that, and that's why Senator Heitkamp lost. Or at least it was a big reason. That's it for today's rant. Jodi Smith up next. This episode of the Plain Talk Podcast is brought to you by Energy of North Dakota. Oil and natural gas from North Dakota strengthens all of America. And through our abundance of talents, innovations, and technologies, energy responsibly produced here translates to worldwide economic stability. With producers and our communities working together, we're securing a sustainable future that generation after generation can build on. It's all happening right now with Energy of North Dakota. Learn more at energyofnorthdakota.com. I have with me Jodi Smith. Now, Jodi is the head of the North Dakota Department of Trust Lands, I should say. She's been there since, what was it? Late 2017, I think, actually, is when she took over.
Sir.
The Department of Trust Lands oversees basically North Dakota's, the lands that we own. Things like, a lot of people don't realize this, but the state of North Dakota actually owns a lot of interest in lands, and obviously those lands produce revenues. We do certain things with those revenues, and Jodi, your department basically administers all of that under the state land board, which has some statewide elected officials on it. But basically, that's your job, is to manage North Dakota's the state-owned lands and mineral resources, manage them to the benefit of the state. Correct?
That's correct.
Now, recently, we've seen some headlines about a misallocation that your office has detected. And I think a lot of people maybe – can you explain this for people who may not be familiar with the situation? What's going on?
So what we have determined just through kind of asking some inquisitive questions through some of the bills that have been proposed this legislative session is determined that, on the reservation, the taxes that come off of it, there's two portions of that. There's the tribal tax and the state tax. So right now there's 50-50. There's a bill that's proposed to shift that to an 80-20 split. And it was kind of our assumption that over the past decade, we were receiving extraction taxes from the state's portion on the reservation. And kind of through doing some research, we've determined that we're not receiving in that. In fact, not only is the Common Schools Trust Fund not receiving it, but the Foundation Aid Stabilization Fund is also not receiving any extraction taxes off of that. And it's our belief, just based off of the Constitution, that our bucket should be filled at 10%, and so should the Foundation Stabilization Aid Fund. The Legacy Fund has been receiving 30%, and then the rest of the funds of 70% have been going to other state funds.
Now, this is a little complicated, but essentially what North Dakota has, and if for those of you listening to this, if you hear state lawmakers or state officials talking about this, you'll hear them talk about buckets. And what buckets are various state funds that our state has set up. Jodi just mentioned a few: the Legacy Fund, the Common Schools Trust Fund, and we have these formulas where, as revenue from, for instance, oil extraction, as revenue from those taxes come in, they get deposited in the various funds in different ways that the legislature set up, and they're always tweaking it. There's always some changes, but essentially there's a formula. When that revenue comes in, we're apportioning it to these different funds. And so what you're saying is essentially this has to do with the tribal lands, and you're saying the extraction tax was it being collected from the activity on the tribal lands?
It was.
Okay, so it was being collected,
so
but it wasn't
has been collected.
Okay.
It just wasn't being distributed into these buckets. And so the interpretation from the Board of University and School Lands is such that because these are constitutional buckets, that's essentially a mandate that those state allocated taxes come into those buckets. And without those buckets being filled, it's a little over $60 million for both the Common Schools Fund and then also the Foundation Stabilization Fund. So in totality, it's over $120 million out of those extraction taxes from the past decade that haven't gone into those respective buckets.
Why not?
It was just my understanding is that some of the statutes are a bit ambiguous, and so it's left up to some interpretation. And we just, are here to have a conversation with legislative leadership about some of that interpretation. And it's our intention to get those buckets filled back up and make those full again, and then to help them with any language that they might need to clarify what that they may need to put into statute to clarify some of that language, so that going forward, those buckets continue to be filled.
Well, how is it? I mean, if there's ambiguous language, and I know that's Treasurer Kelly Schmidt has, her office is in charge of making a lot of those deposits, and she has said that they sought advice from the Attorney General's office, and she has an email, although not a formal opinion. She says that they've sought a fix for this in previous legislative sessions. If the language is so ambiguous, how is it that your office was able to see that there was a problem, but her office didn't, or at least continue to do things the way they are in the status quo?
Well, it's a little bit more challenging for me to answer that one. I mean, it's really sometimes when you have fresh eyes, because I am newer and ask a lot of questions, from our office's perspective, we get transfers of extraction taxes from the whole state once a month, and then we sweep those into those investments, and then we distribute those out through our payments on a biennial basis. And so the assumption just was, when we were receiving those funds, that was extraction taxes based off of the entire state. There was just a natural assumption that percentage off of the reservation was included in that. And it's really not, it's not our purview to really audit any other state agency. And so when those numbers came to us, we made an assumption that it included that. So again, we're just asking that we kind of go back, review some of that language and make those buckets full, because if there's language in those statutes that's ambiguous, that's fine. We just want to work with them to provide some clarity.
How easy a fix is this going to be? Now, I've been speaking with some lawmakers, and they're making it sound like this could be. And granted, we all know that the legislative session and political tempers run high, and sometimes minor things can get blown out of proportion. But understanding all of that, they're saying that it's not necessarily a matter of just redistributing the money. They're saying some of the places where this money went, like the Budget Stabilization Fund, it's been spent. The money's not there anymore. So it's not just a matter of, well, we'll take it back out of this fund and put it in that fund. They're feeling like they're going to have to make an appropriation. Is that your sense as well?
I believe so. So it would be, they could pay us back over time, and that's something that the board has kind of authorized me to discuss, so that it's not our expectation that something gets paid back this next biennium or our current biennium. but that we'd be willing to kind of work with them to find a solution that over the next couple of bienniums, we eventually make that bucket whole. So one idea that has been thrown out there is currently, we are to receive 10%. And if you just up that to 15% over the course of the next several bienniums until that bucket was repaid, then that doesn't have a significant impact on any of the infrastructure needs of the state, but still allows us to repay that bucket. For us, it's important because, as you're fully aware, I know you've written some blogs about this, we do investments and then we have that compounding interest. So to not refill that bucket of over $61 million really has a perpetual impact on the schools and education in the state of North Dakota in perpetuity. I mean, that doesn't stop. I mean, if you pull that money, those tens of millions of dollars out of that fund, it really does impact our ability to provide assistance in the funding that the schools need. So it's important to us. It's an important discussion to have.
Well, there's an opportunity cost, right? I mean, if we don't have the money in the fund,
Absolutely.
It's not being invested, it's not generating revenue. It's like leaving money in your checking account as opposed to putting it in your IRA. We didn't transfer the appropriate amount. So, how hard is this? I mean, you're saying go from 10 to 15%. Is that? I mean, that seems like a pretty easy fix. Is it really going to be that easy? I mean, or what are the complicating factors here?
Well, I can tell you based off of, say, like this past year. And so it always depends upon how much drilling is going on the reservation and the price per barrel. But so it can oscillate anywhere from $6 to about $12 million per month. And so if you take that piece of it, and let's say it was $10 million we should have received per month last year or for the whole year. So it'd really be about $1 to $2 million a month is what we would receive because it was between $6 and $12 million per year. You're looking at about $5 million per year. And so it's $10 million per biennium. And so really it'd be up to the legislators and really the state of North Dakota whether or not they think refilling these buckets at $10 million a year would cause significant strain within the state.
I mean, is there a way that
the budget is...
Yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
No, it's just, when I look at it from the perspective of the state's budget and how significant that is, and you start talking about billions of dollars and we're talking about dollars per year until the bucket is made whole. That would roll us probably across the next 6 bienniums. And the goal, again, with that is to not impact any of those needs across the state and those infrastructure needs, because we are in session and hear of them almost on a daily basis of the needs that, all these communities need. I also sit through a lot of those education hearings because we provide so much financial assistance for the public schools. And I have a pretty good understanding of what those schools also need. And so I don't ever want to take away from what other communities need, but I do believe that we need to make these constitutional buckets whole again. And then, kind of work within the statute and provide that clarity to some of that language so moving forward it's done correctly.
Is the problem in because what I'm wondering is the problem in the constitutional language or is it in the state? Because a lot of times what we'll have is the Constitution will lay out something, but then the statute will sort of contain the details. Is the problem in the statute or the constitutional language?
I think it's in the statute language, and I'm maybe not the best person to ask for that. And I can use the Water Resource Trust Fund as an example for this. And probably the constitutional bucket I'm the least familiar with, so keep that in mind. So that's a constitutional bucket, but in the statute, every biennium, they determine how much funds will be placed into that bucket. So that one can vary from biennium to biennium, whereas the Common Schools Trust Fund, the Foundation Stabilization Fund, and the Legacy Fund, those are all constitutional buckets. And so Common Schools, Foundation Aid, those are both 10 and 10. And then the Legacy Fund is 30%. And so if you kind of look at it that way, like I think, the Constitution is very clear in what it states and how those funds should be appropriated to those buckets.
So what stops us if it's just in statute, right? Constitution's one thing because to change the Constitution takes the vote of the people. That's a little bit different. What stops the legislature from just changing the law and saying no harm, no foul? We'll just, we'll do it one way going forward, but we'll just. I mean, can they do that? I'm not saying that's what they should do. I'm not advocating. I'm just wondering. I mean, is that? I mean, obviously we were living. That
they can.
Sorry, go ahead.
I just don't believe that they can for those constitutional buckets. That's some conversations that they can have, particularly around that Water Resources Trust Fund, because every biennium they determine in the statute how much should be going into that. But when you look at some of these other buckets where the language isn't in the statute, it's based in the Constitution, I think that's where you really need to be kind of careful. I mean, I have it pulled up of Article 10, Section 24, 10% of the revenue from oil extraction taxes from taxable oil produced in the state must be deposited in the Common Schools Trust Fund. Read the same way for the Foundation Aid Stabilization Fund. So, to me, that language is very clearly stated. And then the legacy fund reads a little bit differently, but basically says the same thing.
And the issue is we weren't treating the extraction revenues collected from production on the reservations. We were treating that as though it wasn't produced in the state.
I'm not sure how that interpretation occurred, honestly.
Okay. Well,
yeah.
Well, we know it wasn't being deposited, so I guess that's where we're at. We're all trying to fix it. Well,
yeah.
It sounds like a little bit of a headache, and hopefully it'll get fixed without too much pain, because we do need to make these funds whole. But just last question, and maybe this is just asking a previous question a different way. I mean, at the end of the day, all of this money belongs to us, right? It's all the taxpayers' money. Why can't, if it's going to be too much of a headache, and I don't know that it is, but if it's going to be too much of a headache to fix this, why not just say no? It's all our money, no harm, no foul. Let's just do it the right way going forward and move on.
I think that's just a little bit more challenging, and I think some of those conversations can be held, particularly for some of those funds that are cash in, cash out. So the Foundation Stabilization Fund's a little bit more like that. But for our bucket, because we invest that and there's compounding interest, it's not just today's citizens and it's not today's generations of school kids going to school. This is in perpetuity that this will have an impact on this fund and our ability to make those distributions. So for our board and for our fund, it's really important that we make this whole.
Jodi, thanks for your time.
All right. Thank you so much, Rob.
That's it for today's Plain Talk podcast. Remember, new episodes come out Monday through Friday, right away in the morning, so you can listen in the morning, you can listen in the evening. Great thing about podcasts, you listen when you want. Hey, sorry about yesterday, didn't have a show, had a sick kid at home. It happens, had to take a sick day, but we're back to our regular schedule now. Remember, if you have any feedback on the show, if you're having troubles listening or subscribing, or you want to send in, responses to what you heard or what one of the guests said, or you want to send in questions to our weekly guests, Senator Kevin Cramer or Congressman Kelly Armstrong, you can do all of that at rob@sayanythingblog.com. Also follow me on Twitter at Rob Port. You could find Say Anything Blog on Twitter as well. Just search for it at Say Anything Blog, I guess basically is the handle. And search for Rob Port Say Anything Blog. I have pages on Facebook as well. Great way to follow the blog, follow the podcast, follow my print columns. Basically, you could follow everything I do through those channels. Thanks for listening. We'll talk again.